The Confederacy had ruled the Outer Rim for 3,000 years. Their warships were beautiful in the way that predators are beautiful. They were fast and deadly, and they had never known defeat. When their fleet of 200 warships surrounded the peaceful trading world of Prime, every species in the galaxy knew what would happen next. They would take what they wanted. They always did. Ambassador Al of the Collective stood in the underground command center and watched his screens fill with red warning lights. He was old by his species standards, with gray skin that had seen too many wars and eyes that had witnessed too many surrenders, but he had never seen anything like this. Prime was home to refugees from 27 different species. Millions of civilians had fled here seeking safety. Now they were trapped. He sent transmissions to every major power in the galaxy. The Empire responded first. They expressed deep concern but explained that military intervention was not possible at this time. The League sent a similar message. The words were different but the meaning was the same. You are on your own. The Galactic Council held an emergency session and released a statement condemning the aggression in the strongest possible terms. They did nothing else. Days passed and the situation grew worse. The fleet tightened its formation around the planet. Supply ships could not get through. Food became scarce. Medical supplies ran out. In the underground shelters, children cried from hunger while their parents tried to comfort them with lies about rescue coming soon. But no rescue was coming. Everyone knew it. The great powers of the galaxy had made their calculations and decided that Prime was not worth the risk. Then something strange happened. A communication signal arrived from the far edge of the galaxy. It came from a small yellow star that most species had never heard of. The signal was weak and the translation was rough, but the message was clear. Hold on. We are coming. Al checked the records. The signal originated from a planet called Earth. He had to search 3 different databases before he found any information about it. Earth was a small world populated by a young species called humans. They had only discovered faster-than-light travel 43 years ago. Their technology was primitive by galactic standards. Their military was insignificant. Most civilizations considered them too aggressive and too emotional to be taken seriously. Al did not know whether to laugh or cry. The humans were coming to help. It was like watching a child walk into a burning building. 8,000 light-years away, Lieutenant Commander Danny Carter stood in a gray briefing room aboard the carrier Valiant. The room was packed with pilots from every nation on Earth. They had been called here with no explanation and told only that the mission was voluntary. Danny looked at their faces and saw the same thing in each of them. They were scared and they were ready. Admiral Owens walked to the front of the room. She was 62 years old with white hair cut short and a voice that could carry across a battlefield. She had commanded Earth's first interstellar combat mission 20 years ago, and she had buried more pilots than she could count. She did not waste time on pleasantries. She told them about Prime. She told them about the refugees trapped there. She told them about the fleet and what it would do when it finally lost patience. She told them that Earth Central Command could not officially authorize military intervention because it would mean war with the most powerful force in the Outer Rim. Then she told them that every pilot in this room had been granted emergency leave effective immediately. What they did with that leave was their own business. If they happened to find their way to Prime, and if they happened to engage hostile forces in defense of civilian lives, well, that would be a personal decision made by private citizens. No one laughed. They understood exactly what she was saying. Captain Lisa Monroe was the first to speak. She was 34 years old with brown hair and steady hands that had never missed a shot. She had grown up in a small town in Kansas, and she had joined the fleet because she believed in protecting people who could not protect themselves. She asked one question: when do we leave? Admiral Owens looked at her for a long moment. Tonight, she said. Danny watched as pilot after pilot stepped forward. Lieutenant Chris, who had more combat hours than anyone in the fleet. Sergeant Ben Torres, who had once landed a damaged fighter with no engines and no landing gear. Captain, who had turned down 3 promotions because she refused to stop flying. Ensign Amy, barely 22 years old with reflexes that made veterans look slow. 144 pilots volunteered that night. Not one of them asked about the odds. Not one of them asked about survival rates. They asked only where they needed to be and what they needed to do. Danny found himself standing next to Commander Kate after the briefing. She was 40 years old and she would be leading the task force. Her face showed nothing but her eyes told a different story. She had a daughter waiting for her back home, a little girl named Maya who had made her mother promise to come back. Kate looked at Danny and asked if he thought they could really do this. Danny thought about the question for a long time before he answered. He said he thought those people on Prime were going to die if someone did not help them. He said he thought every species in the galaxy had decided that was acceptable. He said he thought humans were the only ones who disagreed. Kate nodded slowly. That was not really an answer, she said. Danny smiled, but there was no joy in it. No, he agreed. It was not. The task force launched 6 hours later. 3 light carriers and 9 escort fighters carrying 144 pilots. They were heading into a battle they could not win against an enemy they could not defeat. Every tactical analysis said they would be destroyed. Every strategic model predicted total failure. But they went anyway. Because somewhere out there, millions of innocent people were waiting to die. And Earth was the only world in the entire galaxy that decided to do something about it. As the fleet jumped into hyperspace, Danny Carter sat alone in his quarters and looked at the stars streaming past his window. He thought about his parents back home and the farm where he grew up. He thought about the girl he had loved in flight school and the future they had planned together. He thought about all the things he might never see again. Then he thought about the children hiding in bunkers on Prime. He thought about their parents telling them that help was coming. He thought about how that lie might become truth if he and his fellow pilots could just hold on long enough. He closed his eyes and made himself a promise. He would give those children a chance. Whatever it cost him, he would give them that. The journey to Prime would take 11 days. 11 days of running silent through enemy territory. 11 days of wondering if they would live to see their home again. 11 days to prepare for the impossible. The human fleet moved through space like ghosts. They kept their engines low and their communications silent. Every pilot knew that a single mistake could alert the patrols and end their mission before it truly began. So they flew carefully and they flew quietly, and they counted the days until they reached Prime. Commander Kate spent most of her time in the tactical room aboard the carrier Dauntless. She studied the fleet formations and searched for weaknesses she could exploit. The numbers were not encouraging. They had over 200 warships with shields that human weapons could barely scratch. Their fighters were faster, and their pilots had neural implants that improved their reaction times beyond anything a natural being could match. By every measure that mattered, the humans were outclassed. But Kate did not believe in impossible odds. She believed in finding ways to change the odds. She worked through the night and filled notebooks with calculations and strategies. She talked to her best pilots and listened to their ideas. She built a plan piece by piece from nothing but hope and determination. In the mess hall, the pilots gathered to eat and talk and pretend they were not afraid. Sergeant Ben Torres taught card games to anyone who would learn. He said it helped pass the time, but everyone knew he just wanted to keep people's minds off what was coming. Lieutenant Jake sat in the corner with his sketchbook and drew portraits of his fellow pilots. He promised to finish them when they got home. No one mentioned the possibility that he might not get the chance. Captain wrote letters every night. She wrote to her mother and her brother and her best friend from childhood. She wrote to the neighbors who had helped raise her and the teachers who had believed in her. She sealed each letter in an envelope and marked it with instructions for delivery. Just in case, she said when people asked, but everyone understood. Ensign Amy was the youngest pilot in the fleet. She was 22 years old with red hair and freckles and a smile that could light up a room. She had graduated top of her class at the academy, and her instructors had said she was born to fly. But she had never seen real combat. She spent her nights in the simulator running battle scenarios over and over until her hands ached and her eyes burned. She wanted to be ready. She needed to be ready. Lieutenant Chris found Danny Carter on the observation deck one evening. Danny was standing alone in the darkness and watching the stars drift past. Chris had known Danny for 8 years. They had trained together and fought together and saved each other's lives more times than either could count. Chris did not need to ask what Danny was thinking about. Chris stood beside his friend and looked out at the endless black. He asked Danny if he really believed they could make a difference. Danny took a long time to answer. He said he did not know if they could win. He said he did not know if any of them would survive. But he said he knew that trying was better than doing nothing. He said he knew that some things were worth dying for. Chris nodded slowly. He had known Danny would say something like that. It was why he had followed him into this mission. It was why all of them had. On the 7th day, everything changed. The sensors detected 3 scout ships cutting across their path. They were fast and well-armed, and they would spot the human fleet within minutes. There was no way to hide and no time to run. Commander made her decision in seconds. She ordered all fighters to launch. Danny was in his cockpit within 2 minutes. He felt the familiar pressure of the seat against his back and the weight of the controls in his hands. His heart was pounding, but his mind was calm. This was what he had trained for. This was what he was meant to do. The battle began with a flash of light. Weapons tore through space, and the human pilots scattered like startled birds. But they did not flee. They regrouped and attacked with a fury that caught the enemy by surprise. Danny dove toward the nearest scout ship and fired everything he had. His shots hit the hull and left scorching marks but did not break through the shields. Lisa Monroe's voice came through his headset. She had found a weakness. The shields flickered for a fraction of a second whenever they absorbed a hit. If they timed their attacks right, they could slip shots through during that flicker. It was a tiny window. It required perfect timing and incredible precision, but it was possible. Danny adjusted his approach and waited. He watched the enemy shields shimmer with each impact. He counted the rhythm in his head. Then he fired at exactly the right moment and watched his shots punch through the weakened barrier. The scout ship shuddered and smoke poured from its hull. The other pilots followed his example. They learned to read the shield patterns and time their attacks. They worked together in ways they had never seen. Where alien pilots relied on their superior technology, the humans relied on each other. They communicated constantly and covered each other's blind spots and took risks that no sane species would consider. The battle lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, 3 scout ships were drifting wreckage, but the victory came at a price. 6 human pilots were gone. 6 friends who had eaten breakfast with them that morning and would never eat breakfast again. The survivors collected what data they could from the wreckage. They studied the weapons and shields and flight patterns. They learned that the enemy was not invincible. They had weaknesses that could be exploited by pilots who were willing to take chances. Kate reviewed the combat footage with her senior pilots. She noticed something important. They fought like machines. Their movements were precise and their formations were perfect, but they were also predictable. They followed patterns that a smart opponent could anticipate and counter. Human pilots did not fight like machines. They fought like humans. They were messy and chaotic and unpredictable. They made decisions based on instinct rather than calculation. They took risks that made no logical sense. And that unpredictability was an advantage they could not counter. Lisa Monroe put it simply. The enemy expected them to fight like every other species in the galaxy. They expected order and caution and rational behavior. They did not understand that humans had never learned to fight that way. Humans fought with their hearts as much as their minds, and that made them dangerous. The fleet continued toward Prime with 4 fewer days of travel ahead of them. The pilots mourned their fallen friends and prepared for the battle to come. They knew now that they could hurt them. They knew that victory was not impossible, but they also knew that the scout ships were nothing compared to the armada waiting for them. Danny spent the remaining days reviewing tactics and running simulations. He thought about the 6 pilots they had lost and the families who would receive the news of their deaths. He thought about the millions of refugees counting on them and the impossible task ahead. He thought about all the ways this mission could end in disaster. But he also thought about that moment when his shots had broken through the shields. He thought about the look on the enemy pilot's face when he realized that these primitive humans were not the easy prey he had expected. He thought about what it meant to surprise someone who had never been surprised before. 4 days later, the human fleet arrived at Prime. From a distance, they could see the armada circling the planet like vultures around a dying animal. Over 200 warships waiting to destroy anyone who dared to challenge them. Danny looked at the tactical display and felt a strange calm settle over him. This was it. This was the moment everything had been leading to. Either they would save those refugees or they would die trying. There was no third option. Prime was burning. From orbit, Danny could see the fires spreading across entire continents. They had grown tired of waiting. They had begun destroying cities one by one, turning millions of lives into ash and smoke. Time was running out for the refugees below. The commander was Admiral, or a veteran of 100 campaigns who had never lost a battle. When his sensors detected the human fleet emerging from hyperspace, he barely glanced at the readings. 12 vessels against his armada of 203. It was not even worth adjusting his formation. He assumed they were refugees trying to flee or perhaps merchants too foolish to check their navigation charts. He did not consider them a threat. That was his first mistake. Commander Kate watched the enemy fleet from the bridge of the Dauntless. She could see the massive command ship at the center of the formation. She could see the layers of defensive screens surrounding it. She could see the hundreds of fighters ready to launch at a moment's notice. It was the most overwhelming display of military power she had ever witnessed. She gave the order anyway: all fighters launch. 138 pilots poured from the carriers in a wave of steel and fire. They flew in formations that looked chaotic but were actually carefully planned. They spread out across the battlefield and forced it to divide their attention. They moved fast and hit hard and disappeared before the enemy could respond. Admiral Orr finally realized something was wrong. These were not refugees or merchants. These were soldiers. Primitive soldiers flying primitive ships, but soldiers nonetheless. He ordered his fighters to intercept and expected the battle to be over in minutes. He was wrong again. Lieutenant Jake was the first human pilot to break through the outer defensive screen. He flew his battered fighter between two patrol craft before they even registered his approach. He destroyed both of them with perfectly placed shots and then dove toward a battlecruiser 3 times the size of his carrier. His targeting computer had been damaged in the initial exchange. He was aiming by eye alone, trusting instincts that no machine could replicate. He hit the battlecruiser's main sensor array with a burst of concentrated fire. The massive ship went blind in an instant. Its weapons fired wildly into empty space, unable to track targets it could no longer see. Jake pulled away and searched for his next objective. 3 fighters caught him before he could escape. Their shots tore through his weakened shields and ripped his engine apart. Jake felt his ship shudder and begin to spin. He knew he had seconds left. His last transmission was calm and steady. "Keep pushing," he said. Then his ship exploded in a flash of light. Danny heard Jake's final words through his headset and felt something cold settle in his chest. But he did not have time to mourn. The battle was chaos and every second mattered. He pushed his fighter through a gap in the enemy formation and fired at anything that moved. Had never faced an enemy like this. Every species they had conquered fought with logic and caution. They calculated risks and retreated when the odds turned against them. They valued survival above all else. But these humans did not seem to care about survival. They threw themselves at superior forces with no regard for their own lives. They sacrificed themselves to create openings for their comrades. They fought like they had already accepted death and decided to make it count. Captain Lisa Monroe led a strike team directly at the command ship. She had 14 pilots under her command when the attack began. By the time they reached the outer defensive ring, she had 8. By the time they broke through the first layer of shields, she had 4. By the time they reached weapons range of the main hull, she was alone. Her ship was falling apart around her. Half her systems were offline and she was leaking atmosphere through a dozen holes in her hull. Her vision was blurring from oxygen deprivation and her hands were shaking from exhaustion. But she could see the command ship's shield generator ahead of her. She could see the weak point that the analysts had identified. She could see her chance. Lisa Monroe did not hesitate. She pushed her engines to maximum power and aimed her dying ship at the generator. She thought about her parents back in Kansas and the farm where she had learned to ride horses before she learned to fly fighters. She thought about the sunset over wheat fields and the smell of rain on dry earth. She thought about all the beautiful things she would never see again. Then she hit the generator at full speed. The explosion lit up the void like a second sun. When the flash cleared, the command ship's shields were down. Its primary systems were damaged and its communications array was destroyed. Admiral Orr found himself suddenly cut off from his fleet, unable to send orders or receive reports. Danny saw the explosion and understood immediately what Lisa had done. He felt grief rising in his throat, but he forced it down. There would be time to mourn later. Right now, there was only the mission. He opened a channel to every surviving human pilot. "Focus fire on the command ship," he ordered. "Everything we have, now." The remaining fighters converged on the crippled warship. They poured every weapon they had into its unshielded hull. Explosions blossomed across its surface as system after system failed. Escape pods began launching from its sides as the crew realized their ship was dying. Admiral Orr stood on his burning bridge and watched his empire crumble around him. He could not understand what was happening. He had faced 100 enemies and defeated them all. He had crushed rebellions and conquered worlds and built a legacy that would last for centuries. How could he be losing to these primitives? How could his perfect fleet be falling to ships held together by hope and stubbornness? He died still asking that question. When the command ship finally exploded, a shockwave rippled through the fleet. Commanders who had spent their entire careers following orders suddenly found themselves without orders to follow. Ships that had moved in perfect formation began drifting out of position. The mighty armada that had terrorized the Outer Rim for 3,000 years hesitated. Down on Prime, Ambassador Al watched the battle through a telescope mounted on the bunker's emergency exit. He saw the flashes of light and the trails of burning ships falling through the atmosphere. He did not know who was winning. He only knew that someone up there was fighting for his people. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to hope. The human fleet had lost 91 pilots in the assault on the command ship. 91 brave men and women who would never go home. But they had done something that no one in the galaxy believed possible. They had killed an admiral and crippled his flagship. They had proven that the Confederacy could bleed. Danny looked at his tactical display and counted the remaining human fighters. 47. Less than a third of what they had started with. They still had over 150 warships. The odds were still impossible. But impossible had stopped meaning anything hours ago. He opened a channel to Commander. "Ma'am," he said, "we need a new plan." Kate's voice came back tired but steady. "I know," she replied. "I am working on it. Just keep them busy a little longer." Danny nodded even though she could not see him. He turned his damaged fighter toward the nearest enemy ship and prepared to attack again. The battle was not over. The mission was not complete. And as long as he could still fly, he would not stop fighting. The people of Prime were counting on him. He refused to let them down. Commander Kate stood on the bridge of the Dauntless and made the hardest decision of her life. They could not defeat the fleet. That had never been the plan. The plan had always been to buy time. Time for the refugees to escape. Time for the innocent to find safety. Time for 3 million lives to slip away while the humans kept the enemy busy. She opened a channel to Ambassador Al on the surface. The ambassador's face appeared on her screen looking exhausted and afraid. He had not slept in days. He had watched his world burn and his people die. But when he saw the human commander, something flickered in his eyes, something that looked almost like hope. Kate spoke quickly because every second mattered. She told him to prepare for evacuation immediately. She asked how many transport ships were available. Al stared at her like she had lost her mind. He said there were 47 transports, but they were unarmed and defenseless. He said they would destroy them before they reached orbit. Kate shook her head. They would have to catch them first, and catching them would require getting past her pilots. She told the ambassador he had 6 hours to load as many refugees as possible. Then she cut the transmission before he could argue. Danny received his new orders moments later. The objective had changed. They were no longer trying to destroy the enemy fleet. They were trying to distract it. Every time a ship moved toward the planet, the human pilots would attack. Every time the enemy tried to target the evacuation, the humans would make them pay. The mission was simple: keep the enemy looking up while the refugees escaped below. The 47 surviving pilots understood what this meant. They were not expected to win or even to survive. They were expected to die slowly enough to give those transports a chance. It was not a battle plan. It was a sacrifice. Not one of them complained. Sergeant Ben Torres led the first diversionary attack against a group of destroyers moving toward low orbit. He had 7 pilots under his command, and they flew straight at ships 50 times their size. The destroyers turned to engage, and that gave the first wave of transports time to launch. Ben lost 3 pilots in that attack, but the transports made it to orbit safely. Captain took her squadron against a carrier that was deploying fighters toward the evacuation zone. She knew she could not destroy the carrier, but she could keep it busy. She flew circles around the massive ship and picked off fighters as they launched. She was hit 17 times during that engagement. Her ship was more whole than hull by the end, but she kept flying until the last transport from that sector reached minimum safe distance. Ensign Amy watched the battle unfold from her cockpit and tried to control her breathing. She had been fighting for almost 8 hours straight. Her muscles ached and her head was pounding, and her reaction time was getting slower with every passing minute. But she could see 3 heavy cruisers moving to intercept the third wave of transports. They would reach weapons range in 12 minutes. 12 minutes, and then thousands of refugees would die. She checked her ammunition, almost empty. She checked her fuel, enough for one more attack run. She checked her shields, gone. She opened a channel to Commander. She reported that she had eyes on the cruisers. She requested authorization to engage. Kate's voice came back heavy with emotion. She pointed out that Amy did not have the firepower to stop 3 cruisers. Amy knew that already, but she could slow them down. She could make them focus on her instead of the transports. She could give those refugees an extra few minutes. There was silence on the channel. Then Kate spoke 2 words, authorization granted. Amy pushed her throttle forward and dove toward the enemy formation. She had grown up in a small apartment in Chicago with her mother and 2 younger sisters. She had joined the fleet to give her family a better life. She had dreamed of seeing the galaxy and having adventures and coming home as a hero. Those dreams seemed very far away now. But she thought about the children on those transports. She thought about the families huddled together hopping for rescue. She thought about all the people who would live because she chose to fight. And she decided that was enough. She hit the first cruiser's engine section with everything she had left. The damage was minor, but it forced the ship to slow down and adjust course. The second cruiser turned to engage her, and she led it on a chase through an asteroid field, weaving between rocks twice the size of her fighter. The third cruiser tried to continue toward the transports, but Amy doubled back and hit it from behind, forcing it to deal with her. The cruisers eventually caught her. Their weapons tore through her unshielded ship like paper, but by then the transports were safely away. By then her sacrifice had meant something. Down on the surface, Ambassador Al coordinated the evacuation from the underground command center. Transport after transport lifted off carrying refugees towards safety, and in 24 other species packed together in cargo holds designed for half their number. They were scared and hungry and exhausted, but they were alive. A young girl tugged on her father's sleeve and asked who was fighting for them. Her father looked up at the sky where lights were flashing and ships were burning. He did not know much about humans. He only knew what everyone knew. They were young and primitive and not very important, but they were up there dying so his daughter could live. Humans, he said quietly, humans are fighting for us. The girl did not understand. She asked why. Her father did not have an answer. He did not think anyone in the galaxy had an answer. Why would anyone risk everything for strangers? Why would anyone sacrifice themselves for people they had never met? It did not make sense. It was not logical. It was not what any rational species would do. But the humans were doing it anyway. Danny lost count of how many attack runs he flew during the evacuation. He lost count of how many times he nearly died. He lost count of the friends he watched explode in flashes of light around him. He stopped thinking about survival and focused only on the mission. Protect the transports. Buy more time. Keep fighting. Lieutenant Chris flew at his side through most of the battle. They had been friends for 8 years and partners for longer than that. They knew each other's flying styles so well that they hardly needed to communicate. Chris covered Danny's blind spots, and Danny did the same for him. Together, they destroyed more enemy fighters than anyone else in the fleet. Then an ace caught Chris in a crossfire between 3 enemy ships. Danny watched his best friend's fighter shatter into 1,000,000 pieces and felt something break inside him. He wanted to scream. He wanted to stop fighting and give up and let the enemy take him. He wanted the pain to end. But the transports were still flying. The refugees were still escaping. The mission was not complete. Danny swallowed his grief and turned toward the next enemy ship. He would mourn Chris later. He would mourn all of them later. Right now there was work to do. The evacuation took 9 hours in total. 9 hours of constant fighting and dying and sacrifice. When the last transport finally jumped to safety, only 11 human pilots were still alive. 11 out of 144. But every single transport had made it. 3 million refugees from 27 species had escaped to freedom. 3 million lives saved by a handful of pilots who refused to quit. The fleet retreated to regroup and count their losses. They had lost 63 warships to an enemy they should have crushed in minutes. They had failed to capture Prime. They had been humiliated by a species they considered beneath contempt. In the silence that followed the battle, Commander Kate's voice came over the fleet channel. Her words were simple and tired. "All units," she said, "form up on the Dauntless. We are going home." Danny heard the order and felt tears streaming down his face. He was alive. Against all odds and all logic, he was alive. He did not know if he deserved to be. He did not know if any of them deserved to be when so many had died. But he was alive, and the mission was complete, and somehow, impossibly, that had to be enough. The journey home took 19 days. The three carriers limped through space at half speed because their engines were too damaged to push any harder. Every ship was with battle damage. Holes peppered their hulls where enemy weapons had punched through. Emergency patches covered breaches that should have killed everyone aboard. The fleet that had left Earth looking sharp and ready now looked like it had been through a war, because it had. 11 pilots remained. 11 out of 144. Danny knew all their names and all their faces, but he barely recognized them anymore. They moved like ghosts through the empty corridors of ships that used to be full of life. They ate their meals in silence because there was nothing left to say. They slept poorly and dreamed of the friends they had lost. Commander Kate spent most of the journey in her quarters. She had promised her daughter she would come home, and she had kept that promise, but keeping it had cost her everything else. 133 pilots had died under her command. 133 families would receive notifications instead of their loved ones. She wrote each letter personally. It took her 14 days. The fleet stopped at 3 neutral stations along the way for repairs and supplies. At each stop they found crowds waiting. Word had spread faster than their damaged ships could travel. The story of Prime was on every news channel in the galaxy. Every species knew what the humans had done. At the first station, a group of merchants approached Danny while he was overseeing repairs. They wanted to shake his hand. They wanted to thank him. They wanted to understand why he had risked everything for people he did not know. Danny did not have an answer they would understand. He just said it was the right thing to do. At the second station, a delegation from the League was waiting with formal documents. They offered trade agreements and technology sharing and diplomatic recognition. They apologized for not helping when help was needed. Danny accepted their papers politely, but he did not feel grateful. He felt angry. Where were these offers when Lisa and Chris and Amy and Jake were dying? Where was this help when it actually mattered? At the third station, something different happened. A small child broke away from her father and ran toward the human pilots. She was the same girl who had watched the battle from her transport and asked who was fighting for them. She had made a drawing during the journey. It showed human ships surrounded by explosions with a single word written in shaky letters at the bottom: heroes. She handed the drawing to Danny and then ran back to her father. Danny looked at the simple picture and felt something crack inside him. He had not cried since Chris died. He had not allowed himself to feel anything because feeling would have meant stopping. But now the mission was over and the walls came down. He sat on the station floor and wept while strangers from a dozen species watched in respectful silence. The fleet arrived at Earth on a Tuesday morning. Danny remembered that detail because it seemed so ordinary. They had crossed the galaxy and fought impossible battles and lost everything that mattered, but Earth was still turning like nothing had happened. People were still going to work and eating lunch and complaining about traffic. The universe did not care about heroes or sacrifices. The universe just kept moving. But Earth cared. The streets were lined with people when the surviving pilots landed. Millions had come to watch. Millions more watched through screens around the world. The 11 survivors walked down a red carpet that seemed to stretch forever. They wore their dress uniforms, but the uniforms could not hide the exhaustion on their faces or the haunted look in their eyes. Admiral Owens met them at the end of the carpet. Her face was wet with tears she did not try to hide. She saluted them and they saluted back, and for a moment no one spoke because words were not enough. The ceremony that followed was long and formal, and Danny barely remembered any of it. There were speeches and medals and promises of monuments. Politicians talked about sacrifice and courage and the best of humanity. Danny sat in his chair and thought about Lisa Monroe crashing into the shield generator. He thought about Amy diving toward those cruisers. He thought about Chris' fighter shattering into pieces. They gave him a medal. They called him a hero. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a survivor, and surviving felt like betrayal. 3 months later, Ambassador Al traveled to Earth to address the United Nations. The hall was packed with representatives from every nation. Cameras broadcast the speech to billions of viewers around the world and across the galaxy. Everyone wanted to hear what the alien had to say. Al was old and tired, and he walked with a limp from injuries he had sustained during the bombardment. But his voice was strong when he spoke. He talked about the siege and the fear and the certainty of death. He talked about calling for help and receiving only silence. He talked about giving up hope. Then he talked about the message that came from a small world on the edge of the galaxy. Hold on, we are coming. He talked about watching human ships fall from the sky. He talked about the impossible battle that raged above his burning world. He talked about the evacuation and the transports and the 3 million lives that were saved because a species he had never heard of decided to help. His voice cracked as he reached the end. He said that no one had expected rescue. He said that every great power in the galaxy had turned away. He said that the ancient civilizations and the mighty empires had calculated the costs and decided that Prime was not worth saving. But Earth disagreed. A young world with primitive technology and limited resources disagreed. 144 pilots who had everything to lose and nothing to gain disagreed. And then Earth's fighters fell from the sky. The room was silent when Al finished. Then someone started clapping. Then everyone was clapping. The sound rose and rose until it filled the hall like thunder. Danny sat in the audience beside Lisa's empty chair and Chris's empty chair and all the other empty chairs. He watched the ambassador bow and felt something strange stirring in his chest. It was not pride exactly. Pride seemed too small for what they had done and what it had cost. It was something deeper, something that had no name. The knowledge that when the universe had asked whether humanity was worth something, 144 pilots had answered with their lives. After the ceremony, Danny walked outside and stood on the steps of the great building. The sun was setting, and the sky was painted with colors he had almost forgotten existed. He thought about the stars beyond that sky and the darkness between them. He thought about all the species watching Earth now with new eyes. He thought about the children who would grow up hearing this story. Human children and children and children from species that did not exist yet. They would learn about a time when the galaxy had given up and humanity had not. They would learn that sometimes the smallest voice is the loudest. They would learn that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act anyway. And maybe someday, when they face their own impossible odds, they would remember what happened at Prime. They would remember that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. They would remember that hope is not something you find, but something you create. Danny closed his eyes and let the evening breeze wash over him. He was tired. He was broken. He was haunted by memories that would never fade, but he was also certain of one thing. If the call came again, he would answer, not because he wanted to die, but because some things were worth living for, worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for. That was what it meant to be human. That was what it would always mean. And somewhere out there among the infinite stars, 3 million refugees were alive because 133 pilots had believed that too. Their names were carved on a wall back on Earth. Their stories would be told for centuries. Their sacrifice would never be forgotten. No one had expected rescue. But rescue had come anyway. And that made all the difference.